Welcome to episode 6 of Amazing People. Today I have Mr. Alex Streit. He is a software entrepreneur. We're going to talk about everything from business to leadership to what it is to be a great employee and a great human. We're going to talk about tips for success and probably a good bit about science and technology. So with that being said, I'd like to welcome my guest. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
So to begin with, can we get a little bit about your background? I know you have some roots in Switzerland. You spent some time in Australia. What was that all about?
Yeah, you wouldn't expect this for someone who ended up doing what I did in life, but the first 6 years of my life were spent in a house that didn't have electricity and was built high in the Swiss Alps. It was probably built over 300 years ago, and the construction of it and the scene of it would be very non-modern technology. I mean, it was surrounded by fields and mountains.
I mean, besides the non-electricity part, that sounds pretty beautiful.
It was definitely a postcard moment, although interestingly enough, as a kid, you don't really realize that that's a postcard moment. I used to think that the picture of an ideal getaway would be a desert island with maybe some palm trees, and that's got to be the epitome of beautiful. Without realizing that if I looked out my back window, I would have what most people that live on those islands would have as a postcard. So it's interesting how your perspective is very much shaped by what you know. And then when I was approximately 6.5, my life changed pretty dramatically because my parents moved to the U.S., to the Midwest, and my father took a postdoctoral position at UIUC, which is up in Illinois, in Champaign-Urbana. And that university that's one of the research centers for where, NCSA, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, that's where things like Mosaic and the modern World Wide Web was, very, very formative. And so I went from being surrounded by essentially a whole slew of animals and picturesque scenery
and no electricity.
And no electricity to suddenly there was space and rockets and computers and a completely altered perception of what is possible. And I think it heavily shaped how I viewed our potential as humans and what we could achieve. And I got hooked very, very quickly. So in just the short 2.5 years that I was there, I had a very strong change in understanding of what technology could do as far as affecting our lives. And I wanted to be sure that we did that for the good of humankind.
Mm-hmm. So where is USIIC?
UIUC.
Mm-hmm.
So UI is University of Illinois, and UC is Urbana-Champaign. It is about 2 hours drive south of Chicago, and it's a university town, maybe a population of 120,000 people or so, and it's basically focused on some agriculture, of course, but a lot of technology is there as well for the University of Illinois.
I've been enamored by technology since I was a kid, not from the standpoint of actually getting into computers. I like playing games on them and making paint and Word documents and things like that. But I've always liked being on them since I was a kid. I was born in '92, so I was sort of part of that generation. In your perspective, what was it like? Where was computing at when you were growing up, and what have you seen that made you want to get into it in the position that you're in now? And then could you tell us about that?
Sure. I think computers in and of themselves don't really do anything. They're a platform that let us do something with them. And in that sense, I would like to view them as performance-enhancing tools. So really the essence of what we as humans want to do and who we want to be continue through that. But computers are like a performance enhancer. They allow us to multiply what we're capable of by computing parts that previously we would spend so long being bogged down in the minutia of. And I'll talk a bit about that later on as well when I get onto more topics about productivity and these sorts of things. But one of the things that really attracted me about computers was that they freed us, or had the potential to free us, to think about other things. And it used to frustrate me that you would sit in a school classroom, rote learning facts and figures and memorizing times tables and these sorts of things, when I didn't feel like that was a productive use of human intelligence. I felt like these were things that, obviously, there's some side benefit to being able to do a times table really quickly in your head, but realistically, that's something a computer can do better than us. So we should not be focused on doing that. We should be focused on the things that humans are good at, which are the very things that computers struggle with. And that's creative thinking and critical decision making and all of these other things that we are exceptionally good at that computers are not. So when I was growing up and dealing with computers, I saw them as having this potential to being kind of a multiplier effect for our ability to achieve things, but that often they would become complex in and of themselves. And so people would end up, and I saw this a lot with software development and other things, getting so entangled in computing for the sake of computing that we would invent this complexity that wasn't necessarily useful, exactly. Right. And so that was one of the things that attracted me into then going on into entrepreneurship in a software space. Was I felt that we could really take computers and we could harness them for the benefit of simplifying and improving and creating elegance. An elegance that allowed us as humans to then focus on what I believe to be the things that we are good at and take away some of the minutia. And anyone who's used a lot of the modern enterprise software platforms can relate to just the crunching of numbers and clicking of buttons that just seem eternally never-ending in order to do the most mundane of tasks. And that is, unfortunately, the wrong approach. I think that is what we need to try to get away from.
In that vein, when computers continue to automate and do faster and better certain rote tasks that humans historically and up till this day have done, there will be societal shifts from the standpoint of people losing their jobs and things like that, which is a cause of worry and concern for a lot of people, given that large sectors of the economy will be displaced. Now, the way I look at it is that while it's always not cool to see someone lose their job and maybe relocate their family and things like that, but at the same time, it does lead to that person needing to develop their skills at a higher level to then end up contributing something that a computer cannot do. And that may mean that they need to tap into those creative potentials within themselves that they formerly could not get into because they were doing rote work. So in that way, it will be tough short-term transitions, but I think we're headed for a long-run betterment.
Yeah, it is tough. You never want to disrupt anyone's livelihood globally. Nobody wants to have someone's livelihood taken away, and I don't necessarily think that computers do that, but I agree that automation shifts the way that work is needed. And we've seen that historically with everything that we have done. You invent a better hammer, and now the people that used to operate the previous hammer are going to be out of a job. And I think it is a very important challenge for us as a society and as a race to be aware of that we cannot leave the people behind because they have learned a skill of a certain level. This skill is something that's critically useful in a previous pattern, And what I think the tendency is to say, well, you know what, we don't need this skill anymore. What we need now is we need for you to just be creative and change and think. And I don't think that's fair. I think that's
it's definitely simplistic.
Yeah, I think that's what has led to a lot of feelings of people being left out. You know, and a lot of, we see this often in elections, that kind of more simplistic ideas of bringing back older jobs appeals to people. Well, part of it is because these people are being told, you know what you did is no longer relevant or important, and that's not fair. That's not a good way of approaching it. And if you just dismiss them and kind of say, well, you know, you should change everything you're doing, that's not right. Because here's the thing, here's fundamentally the thing. When people operate their job, they learn sequences of how to do things. They get up, they do this, they do it, and they follow this, and they get to work, they follow these steps. And a better way of dealing with this is to take these steps and seeing if we can adjust them to another job industry. So rather than saying, okay, you know what, you're a coal miner, bad luck, start over, how do we take the procedures that they are used to following and adapt them so they can apply those same procedures in new ways, in new places, and maybe bring some of the new industries that are coming in into these areas where these people are, so they can then very comfortably shift from where they were to where they are. And I think that's kind of a key point, is rather than making humans learn how the computer works, which is a very common thing, and we see that all the time in software that's poorly designed, we should design the software to adapt to the humans. Well, that's the same with jobs. We should design our job needs around what humans are naturally already doing, and that way people are much more highly skilled and able to follow into these new jobs. So that's what I think would be a better approach to the problem of automation taking away jobs, as it were. Because I don't think fundamentally what we're trying to achieve is changing. I don't think humans are ever going to stop being human. Instead, we're going to still have the same types of desires and wants and needs, just transposed based on what we're capable of. Today, a lot of people pick up their cell phone and use that for their entertainment, but ultimately they're still seeking a similar kind of entertainment that they would have done 50, 100, or 1,000 years ago. It's still a similar human experience of wanting to engage with culture and news and gossip and all the different pieces.
So when you say that we need to figure out how to take the human patterns that people have developed with their previous jobs, which are not relevant anymore, and then bring them into jobs that are relevant, who is the we? Would it be private companies who invest in humans who aren't people who are not necessarily yet ready for it? Would it be government programs? Who is the we to create those jobs in that way?
Right. I use we to mean any number of people, including essentially all of us. We as humans, we as human beings. But I think, and this is an area that's somewhat outside of my expertise, but I think this is one of the mistakes that a lot of politicians make, is that they kind of say, well, that is done, that industry no longer exists and it's going away, so you guys and girls just need to retrain to do this. And that sounds easy on paper, and it's easy to say, and it appeals to the people who are already trained to do this. But for the
who aren't living the reality of being jobless
But the people who are not getting these new jobs, who aren't retrained, that does not appeal to them. It doesn't speak to them at all, because it's essentially saying, well, you're in the wrong place, you're not important, and we're not really interested in you. You should have been over here, and you should go and do this. It's one thing to be able to say to someone, you know what, just lift yourself up out of what you're doing, and it's another thing to be in that situation and try to figure out how to find that path. You're living in a mining town in the middle of nowhere. How easy is it for you to really transition into a global computer automated role? It's not that easy.
I mean, especially if you need to then move to a city that the cultural norms are different than what you're used to, the type of dialect they speak is different. It's a completely different place.
It is, and it's your home as well. This is where you've lived. This is where you've made a home. You know, you're asking to displace people. You're asking a lot of things of people that it's not my area, but these are things that I think sometimes is missed in a lot of the politics, is that we don't consider the human element enough.
Do you know the song Allentown by Billy Joel?
I do not.
Well, we're living here in Allentown, bum, 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 and they're tearing all the factories down. It's an old song.
Yeah.
Relevant theme.
It sounds like it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know it, so I can't sing it with you.
Okay, so Switzerland to Illinois to what came next in your story? So
I really enjoyed being in Illinois and being surrounded by the potential of all this technology, and then we moved back to Switzerland, and Switzerland is a very systems-oriented place. People have long-established habits, essentially, right? This is how things function. This is how things work, and that was all fine, but it makes them naturally skeptical of technology in an interesting kind of way. So, for example, something like Facebook, which here took off really quickly and globally. In Switzerland, nobody wanted to get on Facebook because their first inclination was, well, wait a minute, what data am I handing over to this corporation, right? And so that kind of very, I want to say conservative, but not conservative in the political sense.
Cautious.
That Americans would see, yeah, that kind of cautious, preserve the current way of thinking and then advance slowly and incrementally is somewhat at odds with the experience that I'd had of being surrounded by this kind of boom in technology.
Fast changing.
Right.
Unhesitating, perhaps.
Right. And so I knew that I wanted to do something, and entrepreneurship was not a thing in Switzerland. There's a much lower percentage of entrepreneurs in Switzerland because it is much more kind of stable economy, and the general process is that you would join an existing firm, and if you wanted to set up your own firm, you had to be well established already. You had to have, deposit a large sum of money into a bank account and use that as a securitization to then found your company. All these sorts of things that are barriers to entry to a young entrepreneur. And at the time, I also didn't know that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I just knew that I wanted to do something that involved technology and that involved doing something that I felt we all wanted to achieve. So
let me try to put myself in your shoes.
Okay.
Because not too long ago, I was in high school and college and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So let me pretend I'm you for a second.
Okay.
So, all right, I'm Alex. I really like computers. I have a background in a more entrepreneurially conservative, hesitant to change country, and I'm here in America seeing all this technology, and I know what my skills are. I don't know if that will translate into me getting a desk job at an established company. It may lead to that for some period of time. That may not be where I want to end up, but I want to learn as much as I can because I like this field. It excites me. It can do a lot of good. I can do well in it. So let me just keep putting my feet forward. Let me keep learning more and more, and let's see where I end up in a few years.
So it was slightly different.
Okay.
But it's a great position. But I think I didn't start with an interest in computers necessarily. Like computers were one of the facets. What interested me was the concept that we could make energy from the sun. So in 1990, I was thinking about how to work with solar, and that we could store this energy and transmit it much more easily than other forms of energy. And I felt that transport and transit was a definite interest, and that ultimately I had this feeling, and this is, as an 8-9-year-old, so it was quite different in terms of maturity level, but I did have a sense that we ought to be a multi-planetary species. And so these were the things that I originally was thinking about, and I was like, how do we get some of these things together? And one of the formative experiences that happened was that, so my mother is Australian. That's part of the Australian connection. And so we went and visited Australia. And up until this point, I had very little idea where Australia even was. It was not something that I had regularly encountered at all. And
well, real quick, we hardly hear about Australia.
Right.
You hear about it, it's so far away from America and Europe.
It is very far away, and it's not in the public spotlight very often. So it's understandable that as a 9-year-old you wouldn't have really thought much of it. But we went because my mother decided that it was time that we understood where she had come from. And so we traveled through Southeast Asia, and we went Thailand and Singapore, Malaysia. We traveled through a bunch of these countries, but we didn't travel
making your way down.
Right. And we didn't travel in like 5-star luxury. We traveled in more of a barefoot, get out into the wilderness kind of travel style. So we really saw the countries. We didn't stay in the capitals. We didn't stay, we really got out and would get guides to take us way out and go into, various different parts of the country. And so I got to see a lot of things very differently, because up until this stage, I'd seen Europe, I'd seen Western Europe, I'd seen Switzerland, I'd seen the US, the Midwest of the US. We traveled all around the US, so I saw lots of different parts of the US. But essentially, I'd seen these types of areas, and it was very different visiting central Malaysia in the late 80s. It was a different experience that I saw a lot of things that changed, again, my perspective. And one of the foundational things that I saw was that there was a bridge, and the bridge had cars driving across it, a regular bridge like you'd see anywhere else in the world. But underneath the bridge, it was just littered with debris, plastic and all sorts of stuff, and muddy banks. And playing in the litter were children.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And above, and then you could sort of see these makeshift kind of places they lived. And above their house, their makeshift house made out of bits of plastic, was a huge, gigantic Coca-Cola sign, angled towards the bridge so that all the cars could see this. And as a 9-year-old kid, I looked at that and I watched the kids, and I was like, okay, how come they are where they are, and I'm up here on this bridge traveling along by car? Like, what chance of nature separates that person's existence from the one that I've had? How have I been able to travel, and this is where they live? And I came to the conclusion that there's nothing special about me. It's not that I am somehow gifted. It's more that by chance I have a better step up a ladder. And so it was this very weird feeling for a 9-year-old to have, but I had this sudden feeling that if I didn't go on and try to do something meaningful with life, then that was almost like an insult to that kid who, if they were in my position, might have done more. And it's hard to describe, but it was this overwhelming sense that it would be ungrateful of me not to pursue my dreams. It would be ungrateful of me not to try to do something.
It was probably an emptying of your own self in a way at that time, like just a complete humility based on seeing something that, in a way, it puts you in awe.
it shook me very, very profoundly. It shook me, as you say, because there was no way that I, as a 9-year-old, had sufficient words to reason this conundrum. How is it that I have so much and they have so little? How can this be? And what becomes of that? Like, what choices do I make that I've made due to privilege? I just didn't have the language to even explore the problem properly. But I was hit and struck by the sense that if I was going to do something based on the fact that I was privileged enough to be up on the bridge and not down on the riverbank, I should strive to try and do something meaningful.
So that experience that you had at 9 years old, let's fast forward years and years, and here you are. That may be, the remembrance of that experience may be what helps push you through when you're very stressed, as I'm day-to-day, career-related, family-related, personal-related stresses will arise and sometimes become bad. As far as I'm concerned, that specific experience is yours, but for me, I've had things that have humbled me and so on. And in my times of trouble, as Paul McCartney may say,
right,
and let it be, those things.
That's a song I know.
We'll get to that in a little bit. When I find myself in times of trouble, my deepest memories come to me, bringing light and wisdom to keep going.
Indeed. I can't sing, I'm afraid.
When I was in India, I went and studied abroad in India, and it was that's the only time I've been to a fully developed country. And one of the horrific things that I saw was there are a lot of beggars and beggar rings there. And the host that we had, who was guiding these bunch of American students as to what to do and what not to do, said, don't give to the beggars. They have their own little, they've cordoned off different areas. Sometimes and definitely don't give to children. And the reason is because the children often work for a beggar pimp, mm-hmm, who then takes their money and whatever. If you do anything, just give them food. So I normally didn't give to beggars, and it's that you see beggars everywhere. You walk down the street, you'll see 3 beggars in 3 minutes. And I'm compassionate, and it really hurt my heart to see that. You talk about coming from Switzerland and America. I talk about coming from America and then seeing this stuff. You hear about it, you see it on TV, and when you see it, even when you're there in the midst of it, seeing kids on the riverbank, me seeing beggars, we don't live it. Mm. It's like we were talking about before with the politicians and the displaced workers. We see them, we're with them, we're not them though. We don't know what their experience is. So the horrific thing that I saw was a little, 6-month-old baby, 2-year-old baby, crawling on the street with a woman who was sitting on the floor. And this street had cigarette butts, probably needles, dirt, water, like dirty water, a rickshaw going nearby, a cow nearby. And I saw them, okay, and they were going to be on my way back. They're near the place I was staying. I went and I got my food to go, like I normally do from this place. And I bought 2 meals this time, 2 to-go meals, one for me and one for them. And as I was going back, and I don't speak the language that the woman spoke, but I just gave her this bag of food. And to my great surprise, she held out her hand and had this fierce look in her eyes, asking me for the other. And I took it bad to begin with. I'm like, I just gave you this food and no one's giving you anything. And then I think more about it, and if she's got a baby to feed, or if she rented the baby, or what, I don't know what it is. I don't know what was going on there, but if you're in that position and you're desperate, you're gonna do stuff that's not cool, that's not savory. People aren't gonna like it. And I think there's a level of sympathy to be understood when it comes to judging their actions.
Right.
Whew.
It's certainly an experience, and it's obviously since then, my enjoyment of travel has continued, and I've visited a lot of places from around the world that have been extremely poverty-stricken. But I'll never forget that moment of just completely surprise and shock, that impact of that one moment. And poverty is obviously a difficult thing to deal with in general, and there's a lot of poverty that we can never understand what it's like unless we live it, and that's the case with the woman that was begging from you. We can't, unless you're in her position, and you can see that this person has a lot and you have nothing, and you're desperate to get as much as you possibly can. You can see how that can happen. But you can never really understand it.
The thing is, too, if Alex and Jay were in that position, we might be doing this exact same thing.
Absolutely. No question. If I was in her position, she is better able to manage her ability than mine. I mean, honestly, I couldn't say that I would do any better. In fact, I'm quite positive I would do worse than her. And I think that's a key thing that is difficult, and this goes for all of the people. This goes for the people whose jobs are at risk that we were talking about earlier. We can't understand how we would react in that situation because we're translating. It would be like saying, oh, if I was a kid again, I would do all these things. Well, yes, if you were an adult being a kid for a temporary amount of time, taking with you your point of view, yes, you would do all the things that you talk about. But when you're a kid, what do most kids want to do? They want to be adults, right? So, yeah, it really is, when you're in that situation, you respond based on what you have in the context. And taking our context and translating it doesn't work. But that's what we do naturally. That's how we as humans operate. We bring with us our context. And it's one of the critical reasons why in order to deal effectively with people, it's important to understand where they're coming from. And you can't necessarily understand their full context, but you can be cognizant that the fact that the decisions that they're making and the way that they are behaving is usually dictated based on a context that has a history. And there could be all kinds of things going on for that person that cause them to react a certain way or deal with, say things they didn't mean to, or just do things that they later wish they hadn't. And if you're in that situation, you're facing that, you'll be much more effective if you can actually understand that that's probably going on for people. Because if the perspective were shifted and you understood what everybody else was going through, you would realize that all of your problems that you have, everybody else is carrying around similar problems, probably some worse than others and better at hiding them. I mean, everybody is carrying around all of this stuff that they're dealing with. And you mentioned Elon Musk earlier. There was an interesting tweet that he did probably 2 years ago, where somebody tweeted at him and said, your life is amazing. It's just like, I wish I could have your life. And he tweeted back and said, actually, it's 99% stress and not much else. Right?
Well, it's easy to look at anybody and based on what's presented, make all these assumptions and believe that those assumptions are the full truth of it. Elon Musk, billionaire, fires rockets into space, owns a really cool car and makes really cool cars. I mean, that's enough.
Right.
Right?
He's also like digging tunnels and doing all sorts of weird
right, genius,
things.
Right? Talking with, leaders of government and stuff like that.
Yeah, he's an interesting character, as are all leaders. No leader is perfect. And the persona that we see or perceive of them is very rarely anywhere close to the actual truth of what it's like. I mean, Elon Musk is a good example. He is mission focused, right? Much more so than I or anyone that I know is, but he believes in a mission, and humans are secondary. The humans that he deals with are secondary to the grander mission for humankind.
They're pawns in a sense, and I don't mean that negatively, but sort of.
It's a pretty apt description.
Yeah, probably how he looks at it.
If you work for him, your happiness and enjoyment is secondary to the mission. The principal thing that he's concerned about is execution of the mission, no matter what comes of that. And in that singular focus makes him an unpleasant character to be around, which the same can be said for Steve Jobs. He was an unpleasant character to be around. He was not the kind of person that you wanted to hang out with. And yet he inspired people and created a lot of great things. So the public perception versus the actuality of somebody's experience in life is always different, and we take the things that we want out of that, which is fine. But our role as leaders, and all of us are leaders. I'm not suggesting that there's one group that are leaders and one group is not. Every single person in constant daily life is a leader, in the sense that other people look to them and observe what they do and follow what they do. In your daily interactions with all the different people that you're interacting with, you're actually acting as a leader. Your behavior and the way you deal with people and the things that you do is part of what forms a leadership that everyone has. Everyone is leading, no matter how insignificant somebody feels. They are actually, in their own area, a local leader.
Well, certainly a leader of their own life, that's for sure, with every person.
And more than they realize, have impacts on people around them. More than they realize. And that's, now the thing about leadership, and Simon Sinek said this much better than I could ever put it, but the thing about leadership is not getting up and giving one speech. Leadership is a consistent application of the same things, right? You're constantly kind of talking with people, interacting with people, and just kind of moving forward something. That is leadership. You shape and change something through constant reinforcement of what you're doing with that. So if you got up and you went to school every day, or you went to play tennis every day at 10 a.m., there's probably a kid that's watching you go to that thing every 10 a.m. that you've never met, might never even meet, but that's seeing you and going, I want to be dedicated like that person. That's cool. I like, these are the things that subconsciously are constantly happening. But they don't see you go once and go, oh, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to tennis every day. They see your consistency. They see Roger Federer didn't just make one speech. He continued to perform not only in tennis, but then afterwards in interviews, when he dealt with people, when he's off camera, when he's off stage. He's constantly being this Roger Federer person that helps shape the people around him and the message and the leadership that he then.
Given the, you were saying this, and before you said Roger Federer and you mentioned tennis, I started thinking about Roger Federer. And as a kid, I was 12, 13 when I first saw him, and I'm still a huge fan of his today. As a kid, he was the perfect role model. And there are things that he may have just said off the cuff, whatever, just the way that he walks, whatever, just everything about him that he's not even thinking of. Because you know what he's probably thinking of? Okay, how am I going to beat Nadal? Oh, how am I going to get this next trophy? What am I going to say in this interview? He's thinking about what he needs to do. But all the corollary things around that, like just the everything about him that he's not thinking of, that are just subconscious, unconscious to him, end up affecting me, as well as the conscious things. Right. And it's not just me. Right. I'm one person in a different country than him. He's got a global presence. So I hear what you're saying. Yeah. And everything we've talked about in the last 20 minutes regarding the poverty, what we carry within ourselves, subconscious cues we give, and so on, are very, very good worldly and sociological discussions, and they have huge ramification and impact on business. I'd put what we just said in the category loosely of soft skills for someone to know and understand. Now, when it comes to someone like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, right, who seems to be very much in their own, they've got a way about them, and that's it. And everyone needs to conform towards that, and they have the power through the money they have, the status they have, and so on, to make other people conform to that way. How does that style of leadership compare to someone who, as Dr. Garagazlu, one of the previous guests on my show, said, a great leader needs the foremost concern of theirs is the well-being and success of the people who are underneath them, to the most junior. Steve Jobs, Elon Musk way versus that way seem to be at odds. Yet, look at the results. They did create great stuff.
Sure, and this is an eternal conundrum that people have been pondering for thousands of years. Was the building of the pyramids worth whatever cost it took? Was the spread of the metric system worth the cost of Napoleon ravaging Europe? These are questions that we do have, and is the destruction that sometimes comes with the change worth the change that then lasts thereafter? But having said that, I think if you think about leaders as being at the top, which is typically how people think about it, that's often not necessarily the right way of viewing it. I like to think of leaders as at the bottom. They're the supporting stability that underlies all of the people that work in the organization. And if a leader of an organization, which is what we're talking now in this context, is doing their role correctly, then yes, they might be very opinionated about where things are going. But at the end of the day, when the attacks come from outside, the people, the naysayers, and all the other stuff that happens, that focuses on the leader. That's part of the role of the leader, is that they take that heat. If you're working on something that's new, that's changing the way things are, and there's a lot of people that are very upset about this, and they come after it, you as the person working in the organization should feel safe that your leader is going to go out there and take that for you, and deal with that aspect of it. And that's part of what Steve Jobs and Elon Musk do, is when Steve Jobs breaks all these molds, and while he was doing it, everyone's like, oh, this is terrible, and no, it's never going to work, and it's awful. And he keeps going out there and saying, no, we should do this. We should, and sometimes he gets it wrong. We should not have a right mouse button, right? We should only have one button on a mouse. I mean, for years and years and years, he held that. But as the people working in the organization, you should be somewhat shielded from that, mostly shielded from that.
Okay, so in your story, we left off last at Malaysia. No, that was when you were 9 years old. We were in Illinois. So what happened between then and where you are now?
Yeah, we started in Switzerland and moved to Illinois. Then we went to Southeast Asia on our way to Australia. When we visited Australia, I got to meet some of my Australian family, and it was a great vacation, but I didn't think too much of it. And 2 years, actually it was more, probably 4 years later, because I was 13 at the time, we moved to Australia. And it was a bit of a shock for me. I mean, I'd gone from a very different environment, starting school in the U.S., not just any school, but a particular type of school. It was the university primary school, which is kind of an experimental school, and then Swiss education, which is unique in and of itself, and then to Australian education, where I got to experience a public high school that was very much based on the Victorian style. Everybody sits in a classroom, somebody stands at the whiteboard and writes up whatever it is that we're supposed to be learning, and everybody furiously writes it down. And this solidified for me my strong sense that humans are often doing things that we should not be doing. Copying down notes seemed to me to be a terrible use of my time. I didn't feel like I was learning anything. My handwriting was neat when I got there, because in Switzerland we didn't write stuff down unless we were interpreting or synthesizing something. And it became very messy as I struggled to keep up with just copying down volumes and volumes of information. And the idea was that you would copy down all the information, you would then be told when the examination was, you'd be told what the topic of the examination was, you'd sit down and you'd read through your notes until you essentially memorize them. You'd go into the exam, you'd repeat what you'd memorized, you'd walk out of the exam and you'd forget it. You'd essentially forget what was in there, or at least I would.
Not just you, pretty much everyone.
Right. And I was like, there's got to be a better way. This to me did not, it seemed to be training me. And in retrospect, at the time I couldn't figure it out. I really disliked school, and I was fortunate enough that I was able to skip some grades, so I was able to finish school early. And thankfully I did that, because I don't know how I would have ended up if I'd continued to endure that. I really did not sit well with me at all. And in retrospect now, with greater awareness of more topics, I'm able to look back at that and realize that that's because that educational system was designed around factory work. And in factory work, our work is very mechanical, repetitive, and based on being able to memorize a sequence of steps and just apply them over and over again. So that style of education makes sense. We as humans are predisposed to following sequences. We're very good at following sequences. And a large part of education is about reinforcing that and teaching us all these mnemonics of who fought what war and how many people, like what year, and stuff that doesn't give you a real appreciation for what happened in history. So here I was, and I had these dreams when I learned that I was going to move to Australia of, wow, this is amazing. This is the place where solar cars could be a real thing. And I became obsessed with solar cars.
Why?
Because they had flat open spaces and plenty of sun. And so the World Solar Challenge, which was a bunch of cars that would race from the north to the south of part of the continent, that was really interesting to me. And I got there and I was very disappointed because nobody knew about it or had any interest in it whatsoever. And it was around that time that I really started to appreciate software. Because in order for me to continue doing things in this field, and I had numerous papers that I had kind of scribbled out how to make magnetic-based train systems and all sorts of like stuff that I was kind of interested in. But in order to follow any of that, to get further, I would need hardware. I'd need stuff, physical stuff, and that was not going to be easy to get. So when I discovered computers, in a real sense, I realized that this one device in and of itself is nothing. What creates the value of that computer is then the soft code, which can be remanipulated over and over again and changed and altered, is what creates the value in that. So I, as a 13, 14, and 15-year-old, could easily work on software. And the best thing about it was the computer would tell me whether or not I'd done it right or wrong, because if I'd made an error in a programming, it would tell me. So it was like an eternal source of information with no need for external stuff that I wouldn't have been able to procure.
It's like the sun.
It was amazing, right? It was like discovering the sun and going, wow, I have a resource here that could be used and reused constantly. And this was in the 90s, and at that time, computers were still esoteric. And at one time, I went to the university and I was allowed to log on to one of their computers while my mother was doing some studies. And so I'd gone along to the university. And they'd let me into this lab and were basically like, okay, you like computers, we need to occupy you. Here, go into this lab. And I discovered this thing called the internet, which in 1991 or 2, that kind of time frame was not much. There was basically a couple of protocols. The World Wide Web was not a thing. It was all very text-based, and you had to know kind of what you were doing, and there was just a couple of universities and things on it. It was not a real thing. But when I realized that I just typed a key and that had caused something to change in another country on the other side of the world, and that change was then communicated back to me, it was a revelation.
Was it also like instantaneous back then? Or did it take like 2 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, it took maybe 2 seconds, but compared to what we were used to back then, that was instantaneous, right? So that was again for me a mind-opening shift in what was possible.
So let's take a look at a broader look on this from a human and life standpoint. I was born in 1992,
right.
And if you look at how things are today, the internet is indispensable from pretty much anybody's daily life, unless you're a hermit or something. So you saw that back then, and it was a revelation to you, right? Let's get into, a little bit later, what is that today? Or maybe that's the topic now. What is that today that is that spark that's so ingenious that could revolutionize things over the next 26 years? Or we can get to it later, it's up to you.
So, interestingly enough, what I think really shifted was, it didn't come until later, but the realization that it was possible kind of came then, was that all these facts and figures, because after this I went back to class to scribble down these notes again.
And work on your handwriting.
And further destroy my handwriting. And as I was writing these notes, it occurred to me that, if I had that computer, if I had access to that computer somehow here, I wouldn't need to write down these notes, because when I needed that information, I could get it from wherever it was. And that kind of sitting in that classroom going, we are doing what computers could be doing for us. That's what I was talking about earlier, where we as humans are good at certain things, and memorizing facts and figures and stuff is not what we're good at. It's not ideal, and it suits a certain type of person, the STEM person, right? It suits a STEM person, a person who will go on to be an engineer of some sort.
You're a STEM person, though.
I am a STEM person, but not really. I'm masquerading as a STEM person. In fact, that's one of the reasons I went and did a PhD, was because I felt that if I was going to be dealing with people who were STEM oriented, then me coming in and just telling them, hey, I have this vision for this, I want to do this and this and this, would feel not dishonest, but not authentic, because I wouldn't really understand the background. So I did my PhD in order to be able to understand the thinking that we need in order to apply these STEM principles, so that when I'm dealing with STEM people, I have a peek into that context to work with, right? So yeah, I masquerade as a STEM person, but I'm
what was your PhD in?
Person. It was in visualizing uncertainty.
Okay.
Yeah, so the central thesis is that we have a natural understanding of uncertainty, right?
Like in our instincts, in our blood?
Instinctually, when we are talking, when we're dealing human to human, when we're talking with each other, even when we talk about numbers, we have a natural feeling for how certain that number is. If I say to you, you know what, tomorrow it's going to rain, probably.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a sense of, that probably, and that I've communicated that to you, that probably. But if I go to a spreadsheet or any of these other computer programs of the time, and I go, okay, it's going to rain tomorrow, probably. So what's that? Like, let's say 85%. So I'll put 85 in there. It's not exactly 85. I had a sense of this kind of shape of how likely, but I couldn't communicate. But we do have models for this. We have all these probability distribution functions, and we have all these methods for like capturing uncertainty. But they're so complicated. They're out of crazily complicated. So what we do is we go through this process, which is essentially truncating all that uncertainty and collapsing it down into a single number, because we can communicate single numbers easily enough with these computer systems. When we're talking, and so I can put together a report and I can talk to you and say, hey, here's my report. Look, our figures are going to be 17. And you're like, oh, so you think it's going to be 17? I'll be like, yeah, probably. But if I had to guess, I'd say 17, but could go up to 20, depending on a couple of other factors. But I wouldn't say any less than about 16, right? So I've got a pretty good handle on the shape of this, even after a whole report, but I can't communicate it to you effectively using the tools that we had. And so I explored how could we make some tools that allowed us to reason better by essentially when I put in a number in a spreadsheet, instead of saying it's 5 and then remembering that, well, it's about 5, and later on I'll try and explain why these numbers are kind of about this and this. I could actually go in and say, well, it's 5, but it's not less than 4, and it's not more than 7, and it's probably going to be about 5. Mm-hmm. So if I can enter that information in, then the spreadsheet can still show me 5, but behind the scenes it can track how much that uncertainty that I put in. And then in the end, when I create my graphs and my reports and my final numbers, that information has been brought along with it and integrated with all the other numbers and all the other uncertainty information. So then when I produce my graph, I can choose to say, instead of just making a nice crisp line, kind of flare it out in the bits where we're a bit uncertain and make it crisper where we're more certain about it and things like that. So it allowed us to then show that uncertainty better. And as any good scientist needs to do, you go through and then validate whether or not this was actually useful. And so I got a whole bunch of people and I tried it on them, and I asked them to use lots of different tools that were available to them and demonstrated that using this, they're able to get better outcomes in less time and make less mistakes. And in the end, you publish a nice big thick book, which not many people read, and you get a PhD, and that's the process. But mostly for me, what was interesting was not so much the topic, but the process that you go through and the thinking that you have to go through in order to do a PhD. Mm-hmm. That was what interested me in doing it. So coming back to this, schools and STEM memorizing facts and things being appropriate for STEM, an eternal struggle that we have as a software development company is that software developers are inherently very STEM oriented. They're very good at remembering facts and figures and things, and they're very good at reading stuff. You can tell if somebody is a software engineer or not based on when the computer suddenly pops up an error message. If they lean forward and try to read it, that's probably a software engineer. If they click whatever button makes it go away so they can get back to work, it's probably everybody else, right? And so that's a fundamental behavioral difference, right? That people don't want to be reading this stuff and trying to interpret, because it doesn't fit with how they operate. An error message is something that is interrupting and stopping you from working, and it's like, oh, it's broken. What do I click to make this go away so I can get back to doing my work? Not, okay, so what does this mean and how is this going to impact? That's not how humans are. So we shouldn't be throwing these error messages in their face and trying to expect them to then read it and understand it and interpret it.
Who, the customers?
Yeah, absolutely. We shouldn't expect customers to want to do that. We should try to adapt our software to how the customers are going to be using it and what they're experiencing. And if there are errors, you don't want to tell them necessarily what the error is. I mean, that's important. What's more important is how do they get past it? How do they solve it?
Right, as far as what they care, yeah, right, yeah. Right.
Hey, I mean, you end up with these ridiculous error messages. Like I remember there was an ISP that I had in Australia, and it would sometimes time out when you were logged in, but the button would still say log off. So you had to click log off, so it would turn back into a log in button. But you click log off, and then the message that would come up would say, unable to log off. Please log in and try again. Like nobody, okay. So I mean, it's good that it tells me what I need to do in order to successfully log off, which is to log in again and try again. But that's an example of just how we end up with this difference in a kind of a STEM world and in a real world. In the real world, people want to be able to follow a sequence of steps that flow naturally, that let them be most effective at what they're trying to achieve. That's what they want to do. They don't want to wrestle with and understand and learn about what the error message means. They want to know how to achieve their.
Well, yeah, I mean, people are specializing into their own thing. If you're, say, a writer who's working on your computer, I mean, you're using a basic word processor, but if you get error messages, you have no interest or care in what that stuff is, nor should you waste any of your time trying to learn it, because your job is to do the writing.
Absolutely, ideally, absolutely.
And for a software company to operate positively in the way that you're talking about demonstrates a degree of empathy. For them to put the testers through the true user interface and pay money to the testers to do that demonstrates empathy. And when you're empathetic towards the customers, they get a product that's better, and then you make more money. And the customer is able to do what they want to do better. It all works.
It does. But it requires a constant and consistent leadership from the non-STEM people to lead the STEM people into understanding that this is an issue. Because as a software programmer, you see errors all day long. Your compiler is constantly spitting back at you different error messages about things you may have forgotten, or your test cases are running. All these things are running constant. So you're used to seeing an error message and reading it and trying to understand what it is so you can go back and fix it. So to you, that's normal, and presenting that to the user is normal. But by having a corporate culture, which is what comes from continued leadership of the people in the company, by creating this corporate culture where we de-STEMize our software, we end up with more human software, and that's something that I always wanted to do was create elegant software that was human usable, and additive to a human's experience. A performance enhancer, not another weird shaped tool that they have to try and figure out how to operate. So in the classroom, we're learning facts and figures, and we're very STEM oriented, and we, at least in that Victorian sense of the education. And if you follow along the education path and you get to the very top of the path, you end up as a professor in a university. That's the educational endpoint, is now you're a professor. And the trouble is, the ironic trouble is, that professors would like to least be teaching. They'd like to least be dealing with education. They would like most to be focusing on their research, which is actually quite a different skill set to the educational system.
It's complete. It's almost totally different.
It's very different, and so we do have an odd system for education, and I think one of the very interesting experiences, and again, this is referencing Asia, was my mother was teaching in Bangkok, in Thailand. My parents used to live in Thailand. And she was teaching at a university. And one of the things that she was really struggling with was getting the students to understand that plagiarism is not good. And the reason is because culturally, if you see something that is good, then you take that and incorporate it in your work. That's not plagiarism. That is kind of building essentially on the shoulders of giants. So we do the same thing, it's just that we cite it, right? In our Western tradition, we reference something that someone else has done, and we cite that we reference that, and that's how we stand on the shoulders of giants. And they do the same thing, but the citation part wasn't really. And once she understood that it wasn't deliberate plagiarism, it was just the lack of citation, because that wasn't something that they were culturally infused with. Once you start to understand that, you realize that it works. It's just slightly different. But it is what is sometimes referred to as a copy culture, right? You can be very good at taking something and recreating it, but you're not necessarily good at creating something new from that. And that's where the difference needs to come in. Is in a lot of these schools, the educational system is very, again, I refer to it as Victorian era. It's very based on following and scoring in tests and learning all these facts and figures and things. And so when you come out at the end, you're very good at repeating stuff. It doesn't necessarily make you good at then coming up with new things. And yet that is what I think humans are best at. Humans are best at their creative. When you get a human into a situation where their back is against the wall and they have to rely on their wits, that's where humans actually demonstrate what they're really good at, which is synthesizing out of the things that are around them a new path that gets them out of that. That's something that humans are genius at.
They run out of time to stall and wait and think that they can figure it out later. That's why they're able to sort of produce magic in the moment.
Yeah, and also realizing that you can't just repeat the same thing, right? You've got to come up with something new to get out of the situation, to shift the situation. That is where human ingenuity is best served, at figuring out how to combine and do these things. And there's a couple of factors. It's trade. It's drawing upon all the resources that are around you, our ability to trade with each other, and therefore benefit from the things that someone else is making, and being able to share and cross-share. So all of these things lead to that same thing of figuring new things out, putting new things in new combinations, and getting in further and further along. That's where humans are really, really shine. The trouble is that this is not, unless you practice it, this is not an easy thing. Being creative is not as easy as we might think, because there is actually discipline to being creative.
There's a default of the mind to go back to habits and roteness, which is why that's so easy to teach in schools also. And breaking out of that can feel unnatural.
Right. Stephen King talks about, as an author who's written so many books and been so successful, he talks about having written far, far more than we ever read, because, and other authors as well, like David Sedaris and so on, have said, I was never good at writing, but what I was good at was sitting down at the same time every day and putting pen to paper. And that's it. What that does is it forces you into that kind of creative space of sitting there and doing it. And the trouble is, if we're so wound up with what I consider to be the minutia of emails and meetings and just all the mundane stuff that we as humans, aren't really contributing our intelligence to, but are just kind of
going through motions,
being a machine. We don't have enough time to really think creatively. We get too bound up doing that. And it would be great if we could find a way, and I think this is part of what great organizations do, is they find a way to make the people be more focused on that creative, pulling things together and solving these big, meaty problems. And one of the things that leaders like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk do is they set these ambitious goals. They talk about, we don't want to just be doing something slightly better. We want to be leaping to that next piece. And by setting these big, incredible goals, it's kind of the good side of having your back against the wall. It's the how do you leap forward to that? And that's where humans excel. That's where, when we're really motivated to do that, we can piece together incredible things to hit that goal. Unfortunately, physiologically, the brain is a very expensive organ, right?
It takes up 33% of your body energy, right?
It takes up a lot of body energy, and the more that you use it, the more energy you're consuming, right? The brain is a very expensive organ to run. So naturally, you want to conserve your brain power as much as possible, and ideally do as little brain use as possible if you want to survive as long as possible without food and water, which is a perennial potential problem that you could run out of food or water. Luckily, we don't have that problem. We have food wherever we want, but we still have that habit of conserving.
Path of least resistance.
Right. So it is an interesting conundrum that we kind of need to find a good way of motivating ourselves, because our natural predisposition, which is a good one and can be useful in some ways, is actually to be kind of lazy, right? If we can achieve the same output with less effort, then that's actually optimizing, right? That's good, right? Or it's lazy, depending which way you want to look at it. So laziness can be useful because it does, help. I mean, if you can clean your house so that you can sit down and be lazy, right? That's a good motivator. Because now, get all this stuff cleaned up quickly. Now I can sit down and relax.
It can also spur the invention of things that are energy and labor saving, which can then end up saving your labor and time so that you can use that precious brain power on higher, better, more creative things.
Exactly. Exactly. So, in a sense, laziness is good, but also, exactly as you've said, the trouble is that if we complicate these systems and we make these very repetitive mechanical kind of tasks take up all of our time, then we don't free ourselves up to do that. We're preoccupied with these things. We do live in a pretty amazing age. We have access to foods and experiences that our ancestors couldn't dream of. It's really amazing what we have.
Much of that is thanks to technology also. I mean, there are economic structures and so on that help proliferate those things, but technology is truly the big thing that's been the society changer.
Yeah, it is. And it's important that we remember we are human, right? Like, technology for the sake of technology doesn't necessarily yield what I would see as a positive outcome. It sometimes, if it's technology for the sake of technology, we just end up creating faster, better.
That's of no use to us, and therefore is essentially useless.
Right. And there was a movie I watched at one time, and I don't remember the title. It was probably The Thief of Baghdad or something. It was a black and white movie, but I remember there's one line in it, and essentially there's a lead character and there was the side character, and the side character had found heaven or nirvana or whatever. They'd found a genie bottle, and the genie bottle had transported them to this paradise. And then the lead character went to them and was trying to convince them to come back on the quest. And of course, the side character is saying, "Well, why should I? Look, I'm in paradise. Why would I leave?" And then the lead character says this line. He says, "If only pleasure remains, is what remains pleasure." And I was about 17 when I saw this, and it kind of struck me, this concept. I was like, our yardstick for what is a good life, several hundred years ago, a good life was not dying from any number of diseases or wars or famines.
Right.
But today, just not dying isn't enough for most of what people consider. They would look at their life and go, "Oh, I don't have what somebody else like."
Yeah, I'm not self-actualized, and
Right.
even it falls into superficial things like comparing yourself with others for things that don't matter, that you didn't want, that you didn't need until you started to think that you needed them. It's
Right.
different. It's a level beyond self-actualization, which is not actually necessary, and it leads to a lot of psychological and sociological problems. Because let's say you actually lived in a paradise as far as the world was concerned. If people were just supremely unhappy, and perhaps that person in the 1800s was better off.
Yeah, I think you can see it when you watch children play. When you watch children play in their virtual life, or even if you look at our forms of entertainment, movies, books, etc. We almost never picture paradise, right? Because that very quickly becomes boring. Nobody wants to watch a movie about paradise. We want to watch a movie about somebody going through some quest, some adversity that they're overcoming, that they're striving to overcome. And that is wired into us. Like, we cannot live without adversity. We cannot live without something that we have to strive to overcome. Because if we do, we get bored. Our minds go into mega lazy and shut right down because there's no challenge for them to have to deal with. So we need a certain level of challenge. The trick is to make sure that adversity, that challenge, is focused in a positive direction. So when we're motivated to, as Kennedy motivated us to get to the moon or to do these sorts of things, we're motivated to do something positive. The trouble comes in when we're motivated by things that are not necessarily positive, and this could be pure profit chasing, right? Any company that chases only profits has a very, in my opinion, difficult time producing positive results.
You mean meaning profits?
Yeah, if your sole focus is profits,
you don't make profits quite as well because you're not focused on the other things that lead up to the profits as anything more than means to an end.
Yeah, you might short-term make profit, but you won't make meaningful, lasting profit. And that's, there is a trouble with our focus on money because money really just represents something else. Money in and of itself is pointless. It is representative of a very convertible something. You can convert money into many things, and it's those other things that money should represent. And
freedom is a big one that it represents for people. Freedom to do what you want, when you want, without having to wake up and answer to somebody.
Absolutely. And that's certainly part of it, and yet our quest to get money often means that we give up our freedom, right? So
ironic, huh?
It is. But it's a sobering thought when you really look at the wealth distribution in the world. If you've been on an international airplane once or twice in your life, you're probably living in the top 1% of the global population as far as wealth goes. And we don't really think about it in those terms. We don't really consider the advantages that we have. We don't consider the fact that I can pick out my phone that communicates with a tower somewhere to deliver to me some information about a restaurant from pretty much any continent with a mix of different ingredients that might have been sourced from wherever, and go there and have my own essentially personal chef prepare for me this meal. Sure, they're preparing it for
I never thought of it as a personal chef.
Going to a restaurant, that's essentially what you're getting. You're getting that experience that in the 1800s or 1700s, no one could go, you know what, I'm going to have African food this evening. And in particular, I'm going to try for maybe some alligator from southern Africa, that kind of food. That's what I'm in the mood for. I mean, we can do this today. We could not have done that.
It's a habituation thing, though, right? If you live in a very abundant society and you don't see these, images from Malaysia or India like you and I saw in person, and even you and I saw, yet we come back here, I'm sure we live like that, I'm sure, right? Where we're aware that there are problems around the world, but we just live our lives.
Right.
Because this is the surroundings that we have. This is our life.
This is our context, exactly. And I think the trouble is that, as you say, you get very used to this and you see it, is that if we don't face enough challenge within our own lives, we tend to create our own challenge. And politics is rife with this, right? If the existence of the two-party system is premised on them disagreeing on things. Otherwise, if they both agreed on everything, nobody would vote for either of them, right? We need by definition, and it's a problem that exists in a lot of our.
You're also defined more strongly the worse the opposing side is also.
Yeah, for better or worse, we as humans are attracted to salacious, explosive, and generally more fiery things. If someone comes out and says something positive, we're less attuned to that because it's not a life danger to us. But if there's something horrific that's happened, it's all over the news and we're all glued to it because I guess historically, this represents danger that we might have to be alerted to. Today, we don't have we have very minimal danger, and so we have to almost manufacture danger for ourselves in order to satisfy that danger element.
Yeah, and it's internal. It ends up causing a lot of social anxiety. What may have been an evolutionary thing 100 years ago about a bear or a rival tribe or something. It's about the person that's in your class or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We just,
and it feels just as real.
It's part of our condition, and it's just a part of our nature, human nature.
So we've talked about how people are, right? What about moving beyond that? Can we evolve out of that through just conditioning ourselves outside of it, like reading psychology books enough and uplifting ourselves from those anxieties? Do you think technology has a role to play in it? I don't know. I don't know about that, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think this is where being able to focus ourselves on the right challenges really helps, right? And I think that the human condition, the way that we are, is going to be perennial. We're always going to need some element of danger in our lives and some level of excitement and some level. We're going to need these things any which way. But fitting that, getting what we need out of that into a challenge that propels us in a direction that we want to go is one way that we can positively make use of that. I don't think we can ever say, let's take humans and turn us into perfect beings, because I don't think we can do that. But I do think we can look at ourselves and say, well, there are certain things that we require, and there's a whole lot of physiological systems that underpin that, dopamine and serotonin and all these sorts of things. So if we understand how these different neurochemicals interact and how we respond to certain things, if we can harness all of these things and focus them towards a productive challenge that we want the outcome to be, then we can shape ourselves in a positive direction much more effectively than if we try to just eliminate all of our
channel in the right direction. And I think that given that corporations hold such a power not just over what happens in the world, but how people live their lives, because a lot of people, 120 million people in the US work at a corporation, big or small. I think corporate leadership can start implementing that to achieve the goals that they set out, which can allow those things to be achieved more effectively, whilst creating the personal developments within the people who work for them and they themselves. And I think that will be, I think a radical shift in how things work and a radical improvement in how much stuff gets done and how good people feel about it.
Yeah. I don't know. Corporations are made out of people, and I don't know that corporations are the sole people, but they're definitely sole parts of that equation.
Change,
But
yeah.
I definitely think that they have a role to play. I think corporations are formed out of people, though, so it's really the people that are in the corporations that can affect that kind of impact and change. I think where technology plays a key role, and where at least I'd like to focus my time, is in allowing us to remove a lot of the resisting parts of our lives that cause us to not achieve things. And when I was younger, I used to liken this to circles and lines. Right? There are many tasks that you can do on a daily basis that essentially form a circle, because when you're done, you're essentially back where you started. Right? And this one example is, you can clean your desk, you can rearrange stuff, you can go through your email, and you're essentially just kind of circling back to where you were. And you can do this for 2 weeks. You can sit there and feel busy.
We're just two lost souls swimming in a fishbowl year after year, running over the same old ground. From Wish You Were Here.
Right.
Pink Floyd song.
So that's a circle. A line is anything that you do where after you've finished, it's moved you slightly. And in our lives, we're going to have lots of circles. I mean, there are things, dishes need to be done, and then you need to eat. So the dishes need to be done, but then you need to eat. And it's an eternal circle. You're always going to have to do dishes, and you're always going to have to eat. So that's a circle that's forever going to exist. But you could do that your whole life and nothing else, and you would be where you started. Whereas if you pick up a book, or you take a course, or you sit down to write, or you do any of these things, it might be a minute, but it is a small increment. And then the next time you're doing a circle, but it's now starting at a different point. So the important part is to understand in your life, how many of these circles have you got? How many of these circles, because we often create circles because they're easy, right? Our brains, we can switch our brains off and start to just follow the circle.
Habituation.
So we can go into work, and we can spend the whole day scanning through our emails, rereading the same emails, moving emails between folders, filing a bunch of things.
Personally changing, not at all.
Correct.
Not improving, yeah.
Not advancing anything else, so that we return back to our state that we were in before. But if we even fit just 1 hour, if you look at that and you go, I have a lot of circles, I don't have a lot of lines, I'll fit in 1 hour a day somewhere, or half an hour a day, it doesn't really matter the increment, on a line, then over time, progressively, you'll go somewhere, right?
Guaranteed.
Something will change. And books is a great one, obviously, but it can be gym, it can be walking around the block once a day, right? It's something, whatever it is, something simple, small. If you take an elevator, it's a circle. If you take the steps, it's a line. It's just all these little things that add up that you can go through your life and go, well, I know how to reduce a bunch of circles. I know how to reinforce and expand upon the lines that I'm drawing. And ultimately, that's one way that you can shift without dramatic change. You can start to shift where you end up over the course of time. Of course, habits are always difficult to break, and we often feel the need to make a dramatic break. All right, January 1st.
Done.
I'm
just done, whatever it is.
Whatever
I'm
it
done.
Is, I'm going to go to the gym, or whatever. We have to make these dramatic declarations and things. But really, if you look at it just as a circle line problem, you'll actually find there's lots of small little circles that hang around all the time. I'm going to go on my phone and look at some social media, circle, right? It's very easy to just try to evaluate these things. So I think that's one of the things that we can do, is just every day.
Yeah, as a people, irrespective of corporations, and yeah, right.
Exactly.
Well, and the effect is more happiness for the person who does it. It's not. I don't want to use a computer term, but it's not efficient to just keep going in circles. But to use a more human term, it's not happiness inducing. It's stale. It's like stale bread. You can eat it. It's not good for your spirit. It's not good for your body. It's not good for your tongue. Yet it's safe and it's comfortable and it's easy, and that's pretty much all it is.
Right. And again, there's a reason why we seek out that comfort. Our brains are expensive, and it would be better not to run it. In fact, it would be ideal to keep our brains on a very low
hibernating,
and our bodies are hibernating. If we could just lie on the couch and eat a chip every now and then in order to continue our sustenance while watching some television that doesn't demand much thought. I mean, that's a pretty ideal from
that actually sounds kind of nice.
Right, from a human physiological point of view, that's a pretty ideal existence, right? That's essentially paradise for your body, temporarily.
Yeah.
So there is that. Of course, the ancient Greeks and Romans referred to this as the vices of the
rich
flesh,
or something.
The flesh, right? If you look at Greek statues, they always try to downplay the certain parts of the anatomy, because they want they feel that the really important stuff happens up here in this sort of higher order thinking, as they refer to it. Right? Mm-hmm. That's where the meaningful stuff in life occurred.
Right.
And the pleasures of the flesh, all of the eating and everything else that we do, they're like distractions. They're lower order things. I mean, when we should be aspiring to these higher order things. I mean, that's how the ancient Romans and Greeks talked about this.
Right.
And I don't really like to talk about higher order and lower order things because
Well, it's important.
Yeah, but I think that implies a kind of a
hierarchy
a binary hierarchy,
which doesn't encompass the fullness of life. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's one of the beauties of life, I think, is just how amazingly diverse and complex, and just there are so many different people who have different experiences and different views and different everything. It's exciting to learn all the. It's like the most intricate puzzle you could ever come across.
Well, you can spend an entire lifetime learning one person.
Absolutely. Let alone 6 or 7 billion others, right?
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And you learn the person, but not just the person, the context within which they live, the greater society, everything fits together. There's so much of life to experience. There's so much. It's an absolutely incredible experience. So to break it down into these binary things, I think has a tendency to create an unstable bias towards one direction or another. Being the opera is somehow a higher order thing, whereas graffiti is somehow a lower order. That kind of thinking, I think, could be interpreted from a higher order, lower order type of hierarchy. But graffiti has its place. There's an artistic value in it, and you look at the artists that are in the street art space, from Basquiat to Banksy and all these artists. I mean, they're the expression and the various commentaries, and there's a lot.
Right.
A lot of complexity, a lot of interest, and as someone who enjoys experiencing life, it's incredible to see all these different forms and to try and label them into, opera is somehow a higher order art, whereas street art is somehow lower order. I think that just takes so much away from our ability to enjoy.
Yeah, there's a reason people do it though, because people's minds do like to discern and figure out what's good and what's not, and a lot of it's
categorized.
Yeah, a lot of it's based on what people are used to, and then just affiliations based with what they see with the opera people and with the graffiti people. So,
Right.
I'm not saying that that's the right way to look at it, but that is the thinking behind it.
We love categorizing things, and there's a benefit to that, which comes back to the
Simplicity and
simplicity. I can operate if I can put a whole bunch of things into a box and label that box mentally, then I can say, okay, if I see any of the things that fall into this category, it's this, and then I can move on. So
Right.
there's that saves some brain power. So now we're back to that's an efficient use of our time, so we can be more efficient about how we run our days. So we like to categorize things. There's a benefit to it. It does. We naturally do it. We're naturally predisposed to categorizing things: safe, unsafe, right? All these types, essentially, that's part of our ability to stay alive through all the different things. Comes from being able to categorize things very quickly, sort things out, understand things. You watch a baby as they develop; they'll sit there and taste everything, try everything. They'll have no fear, or very little fear. There's a few things that they will naturally fear, but mostly they won't realize how dangerous a lot of things are, and you have to go through that process of explaining hot, not hot, all this sort of stuff. And so they're forming these categories that help them, because without it, if we had to evaluate every single thing in detail, we would never get out of our front door, right?
Right.
So yes, we naturally, as humans, are categorizers. That's one thing we do. It's one thing we're good at as well, is putting things into categories. So good that we overdo it.
Yeah, and this explains the underlying reason as to why we end up seeing a lot of the simplistic judgments that people make and things like that, because
Right.
There's a reason why all of the problems that we like to complain about are there, and a lot of it's just based in evolutionary survival.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the problems that plague us are, there's two sources of them. The first source is us as humans. The second source is in all the structures and paraphernalia that we've built, right? So us as humans, we have a bunch of things that we're good at: categorizing things, keeping ourselves alive, striving for a particular goal. There's a number of these sorts of things that we naturally are good at. And then we've built and constructed society around ourselves. So the way...
and that will reflect what's going on inside the person.
Yes. It reflects what's going on inside of the person. It also... So there are computer games and also social media is designed around dopamine reward systems, right? So in computer games, the primary driver and motivator to continue to strive towards something is based on a dopamine reward system. So as humans, if we see something, we strive for it. Once we get it, so when we first see it, we get a shot. When we get it, we get a shot. And then we look for the next one so we can get another shot, right? So that's one of the things that sort of motivates us to go. These are things that we have that cause us to go, you know what, that couch existence, I see an apple tart over there and it's looking really good. I should get up off the couch and go and get that apple tart, right? There's something that motivates us to go and do that, right? Gets us out of that, what would be paradise for our, essentially maintaining our brain with minimal power, right? So we need that, right? So we have that. We have these motivators that get us to go on and do these things. So we have all these types of patterns that aid us generally, categorizing things so we know when something is unsafe. When the leaves rustle in a certain way, there's probably a tiger behind it. So
or a snake.
Or a snake.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we have those things, but then we build up the societal structures around it, right? And societal structures have a very strong impact as well on how things function. There are certain things that are human nature, and there are certain things that are as a result of societal structures. As an example of something and how dramatic an effect it can have is one of the problems that England was having was, they'd had a civil war and all these sorts of things. So the Americas had been plundered by the rest of Europe, and England was well and truly behind. So how were they able to get back into the game? Well, there's a couple of societal shifts that they did. First of all, obviously, having a civil war doesn't help. But once you get past that, there's a couple of things they did.
When was this?
This is back in the 17th century.
Okay.
So one of the things they did is they created the corporation. So the corporation, as we have it today here in the U.S. and many places in the world, is based on the corporation model that was created in England in order to open up the Americas to exploration. And it's the limited liability corporation, right? So the idea was that you put forward some money into some endeavor, and that was the extent of the amount of money that you could lose. So if it went wrong, then it went wrong and you just lost whatever that was. Prior to that, what was happening was people would sponsor an expedition to try and find El Dorado, which was part of the big thing, right? Who can find El Dorado? Sponsor an expedition to the New World, and then they'd come back and the cost would be astronomical and they'd have to pay, right? Because they were the sponsor, and it turned out that we needed all this extra stuff, so you have to pay up. And so there was no limit on liability. Well, that meant that nobody wanted to fund these expeditions, and so that meant that England was well and truly behind in the race. But when they created the limited liability company, essentially what it meant was, here's an amount of money. Now you're going to go off and explore, and you have up to this amount to spend. And if you go beyond that, that's on you, because there's nothing further that you can get back. Well, suddenly everybody was investing in creating these new limited liability companies, and that's the foundation of most of the corporations we have today. So that's one thing that happened that shifted the way England played. Another one was patents, right? So patents were also created in England. And part of the reason that patents were successful was before that, people didn't want to reveal how they were doing things. So if you were an excellent ship maker and you'd figured out a certain way of making a ship that made it better, you didn't want to tell anyone about it. You'd hide that secret, and you'd try and work it for as long as possible until somebody stole that secret from you, and then the game was up. Well, what a patent did is it was like, okay, here's the deal. You tell everyone how you make your ship faster, and in exchange, the Crown will only let you make it that way for 20 years, which back then, 20 years, technological advancement was less slower. It was a very short period of time, but it was sufficient that you could make good money. And in exchange, everybody else, all the other ship makers learned. And then they could take that and they could improve on it and create something new, and then they'd have their own patent for that. So that spurred this sudden technological golden age, because now people had incentive to go off and do that and so on. So we can build these societal structures that work, but sometimes we confuse societal structures for human nature, and we think that the way that we are doing things based on the structure that we built up around ourselves is the only way to do something, when in reality it's not. It's a structure that we have built.
As per the level of intelligence and resources and imagination available to the people who built those structures.
Right. And sometimes those structures are no longer appropriate now, but very appropriate then. A classic example is, Sony, the company, when Akira Morita passed. He was the founder and the big boss at Sony, and so after he passed, they got a new big boss, but that big boss never dared change anything. If Akira had said, we need to have this type of distribution structure, then that's how it was. And basically the company just froze in time and nothing changed because nobody dared change what had been set before. So they had to end up bringing out an outsider, someone from outside Japan, to come in who didn't have the respect needed for the hierarchy that pre-existed, right? So that's an example of where sometimes we overassume.
As a result, what happened to Sony?
So they had to bring in Howard Stringer to come in and change everything and basically smash down the old ways of things, because those things made sense when Morita designed them. They made sense because it fit the market. But then as the market shifted and he was no longer there to make the changes, they started to no longer fit. And so now there was a distribution model that assumed that planes were a certain price and ships were a certain price, for example. That was no longer true, but we were, as Sony, would be stuck in that model. And so we do the same thing in society. That's just a very micro example of a quick how something can be created and then people take it to be unchangeable. And so there's all these adages like rules are made to be broken and all these sorts of things. And the truth behind those types of adages is that the structures are created by humans, for humans, with a specific intent in mind at the time. And not always are they correct. And that's where the societal structures are not necessarily as fixed in stone as we think.
You end up seeing someone like Steve Jobs, who was very good at bending reality as to his own vision. And the most famous example is with the iPhone, in which he said that customers don't know what they want. I know what they want. And he was meticulous and perfectionist when it came to implementing that iPhone exactly as he wanted it in order to make that reality come true. He had to believe in it so strongly, though, to the point that he became the frame maker rather than the frame taker. Because smartphones that existed before Steve Jobs, it was the BlackBerry, which is extinct now.
Yes, indeed.
Because someone with a stronger will and a stronger ability to put these things together and a stronger understanding of the fact that these structures are malleable, then malleabled it. He changed it.
Right. It is. Customers don't know what they want. That is true. They know what they want, but they don't know what they need. And another classic quote for this is Henry Ford, who said, if I listened to my customers, I would build a faster horse. The customer will ask you for what they already have because that's familiar.
Or a better version of what they already have.
A better version of what they already have. It's always gonna, and that's normal, right? And that's good because customers shouldn't be sitting there thinking about what the next product should be.
That's the business owner's job.
That's the business's job,
yeah.
Right? That's what they need to do. Now, to Steve Jobs' credit, he also was able to recognize when he was incorrect and change his mind. Not all the time smoothly. I think in his younger years, particularly, I already mentioned the mouse, insisting that a mouse only ever had one button, moving on to the iPhone originally, it had to be a certain type of development environment. There had to be certain things, and they changed, they adapt, they improved it over time. But here's what's fundamentally important about the iPhone and a lot of technological devices. I think the revolution that we're in right now, the change that is going on around us, is that when you buy an iPhone, the day that you get it, it's actually not very useful. It can make calls, it can do basic things. But then you start adding apps, and you start adding more apps and changing apps. And then the apps get updated, and you add some different apps, and you change things around. And your phone gets more and more and more useful as you go along. So the day that you bought the phone versus what you have in your hand today are two different things. That was never true before, because what happened was if you bought a Nokia or a BlackBerry, it came with the email or whatever functions it had, and after 3 years, you had the same functions, just less battery life. Today, you still have less battery life, and you have all these other, physical, mechanical problems. But what's changing is that the phone is more valuable after you've used it than before you use it. And
as compared to like a car.
Right, exactly. And this is where Tesla, I think, is unique, is when you buy a Tesla, it is really just a computer on wheels, right? They update and change the features. So the day that you buy the car versus 1 or 2 years later, they're not the same. It's actually a better car 2 years after you've bought it. And that's something that I think Silicon Valley gets because they've been there for a long time. It's also fits in with what I saw with software is the computer stayed the same, but the soft manual pieces on it allowed you to make more out of what was there. So it's like there's that change, I think, is happening more and more. And it's all the things consolidating down onto reusable chunks. So where we used to have all these different computer programs on our computer in order to use all these different things. Today, a lot of the stuff we do is actually just through a web browser. So we have one computer program and the rest of it can be changed and updated and fluid. I think that trend is seeping out more and more into more areas. I think Tesla's a bit unique because they're a bit advanced in doing this in the car space. But Tesla is not a car company. And I think if you think it's a car company and you compare it to other car companies, you come to the conclusion that Teslas are overpriced and not really worth it. But that's because you're misunderstanding what it is. It's not actually just a car. And it's the same as what the iPhone did with the phone. When the iPhone first came out and people put it up against the BlackBerries and so on, it was panned. I mean, people forget, but it was panned. People were like, no one will ever use this. Business will never use an iPhone.
Probably look like a toy by comparison.
Yeah, I need buttons in order to feel what I'm typing in, all these sorts of things. Like people resist the change, of course, and they go, but what was critical about the iPhone, what made the iPhone was the apps, right? The user the being able to scroll and touch, that's great, but every other phone can do that as well. What really makes the iPhone powerful was their apps and their app store. Now, Android came along, but Android, iPhone makes pretty much all the profit in the mobile phone space. The Android came along, but the Android didn't really have the same coherence in the app store and all these. They misunderstood the apps. They thought that what mattered was the screens and the physical things was the focus. We can make it cheaper. We can have more memory. We can have removable memory. We can do all these physical features, but they misunderstood the store. In recent years, they've gotten much better, and they've turned around and realized that actually, that's great and all, but to really make this phone valuable, it's in that software, it's in the apps, it's in doing those things, and so they've caught up, no question. And this happened quite a while ago, but it's just an example. This, I think, is something that's going to happen more and more all around us. This, some people talk about the Internet of Things and all this sort of stuff. I think the trouble is that today we buy a washing machine, we buy a drying machine, we buy a dishwasher, we buy some lights, we buy all these things. And it used to be that they're all completely separate, completely different. And then there was this trend to start making them smart, so they would have these endpoints and talk. But then there's a couple of companies who got it, like Amazon, and realized that you tie everything down to Alexa, and then the Alexa will control your lights, your washing. You can start to. That's the current technological wave that I think is happening. Is that we are getting to a point where we're really realizing that it's not just about constantly making bigger, better hardware bits. We're going to keep making bigger, better cars or whatever it is. In reality, what's going to really matter is what can we then do to improve that internally. And I think that's, at least for the next 10, 15, 20 years, that's going to be a big trend that's going to start taking over a lot of the other areas and industries.
So where does your position fit in with that? So you were an entrepreneur at one point. I believe you work at a company now. So what's a little bit about your history after PhD?
Sure. So I'd kind of always been entrepreneurial. I'd set up several companies. Some were small, like consulting, and some were just me on my own when I was a teenager. And I'd always, like, once I discovered that you can actually make your own company and do stuff, then I did. Right. That was because I enjoyed doing what I wanted to do, and a company just was a structure that allowed you to continue to do that. And when I finished my PhD, together with a friend of mine, we founded this company. And the purpose of the company was to take what we saw as these clunky kind of hardware specialist pieces and do the same thing in software.
In the days before my dad died, you helped console me quite a bit, and you told me that I was in a lot of distress, and you told me that I have a human family that I can look to for help and support, and I really appreciated that. So thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for all the work you've done to make technology better, make the world better, and to talk about everything you've learned today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Thanks a lot, Alex.